you everyone for joining us this evening for the Sierra Sacramento Valley Medical Society Museum of Medical History lecture series. We are excited to have our speaker here tonight. My name is Sam Mello. I'm the events coordinator here with the Medical Society, and thank you for joining us. Throughout the program, if you have questions, go ahead and put those into the chat or the Q&A function down at the bottom, and we will get to your questions at the end of the program, time permitting. So I would like to introduce Dr. Bob LaPerriere. He is the retired physician and museum curator for our medical museum here in Sacramento. So go ahead, Dr. Bob.
Thank you, Sam. Good evening and welcome, and thanks for attending tonight. This is our last virtual lecture for the year. Because of the pandemic, we've not had a lot going on. We have two that are on our website that you might be interested in checking, and this one will also be recorded and will be put on the website. A couple of reminders. Number one, our museum is open on Tuesdays by appointment, and you can make that appointment directly on the website for the museum, which will be in the chat box for you. Our next lecture will be in February of next year, and as I recall, it's going to be centered around Mare Island and Touro University and the medical history of Mare Island. Also, make sure you check out our website. We've got hours and hours of things that you can peruse in the website, and I think if you've not been on it, you'll enjoy what is on there. That is all from me, and I'd now like to introduce Dr. Dylan Carroll. Dylan is a Chico, California native who received his PhD in history from the University of Georgia. He currently is a full-time history instructor at Butte College. He's published in the Civil War History Journal, as well as popular formats such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and blogs such as Nursing Cleo. His book, Invisible Wounds, Mental Illness and Civil War Soldiers, will be released on December 15th and is published by LSU Press. And I'd like to thank Dylan for speaking tonight and like to introduce Dr. Dylan Carroll.
Thanks, Dr. Bob. I appreciate the introduction. Good evening to everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. I'm not quite zoomed out yet. Okay. All right. So my talk today is called Invisible Wounds, and it's drawn, if you'll permit me with a little shameless self-promotion, it's drawn from my forthcoming book, Invisible Wounds, which comes out actually a month from today. So December 15th, it'll be available. All right, shameless self-promotion over. If you guys will humor me, I want to start by talking about several specific Civil War soldiers. This was Theodore Otis. He was a Roxbury, Massachusetts native born to an elite farming family. His father was very wealthy, serving at one point as the mayor of Roxbury. In 1861, Theodore volunteered with the 24th Massachusetts Infantry. He served a year with the unit before being discharged, and he then re-enlisted with the 3rd Massachusetts Cavalry, eventually rising to the position of second lieutenant. His unit served in the Gulf, occupying New Orleans, fighting at Port Hudson, fighting at the Battle of Jackson, and serving in the Red River Campaign. Like many Civil War soldiers, Theodore Otis had repeated bouts of illness. In the spring of 1862, he had a long, drawn-out battle with disease, which he surmised was from the drinking water. He wrote his family, quote, "The cause of my being sick was drinking the river water, which we had to at first, but now we have wells." He wrote later about this long bout with illness, describing to his family, quote, "The diarrhea stuck to me. However, I have about thrown that off. I have lost 15 pounds weight," and he estimated he weighed at that time about 142 pounds. Theodore's letters during the war describe a soldier who struggled with ill health, who struggled with exposure to the elements, poor rations, everything that most Civil War soldiers struggled with. He may have, though we don't know for sure, struggled with the challenge of combat. He never writes about that, so we don't know for sure. But by 1864, after participating in several battles, he wrote his family, quote, oops, sorry. Whoa, sorry, I got messed up here. I don't know how that happened. Okay, he wrote in 1864 to his family, quote, "If this campaign lasts a couple of months longer and I leave to stand what I have had to for the last 2 months, I shall either be under the ground or out of the army." Following the war, Otis returned to Roxbury and his father's household. He joined a friend, Augustus Caldwell, in starting a florist business, which apparently was successful, probably in no small part due to his wealthy father's support. This is the 1870 census, and we can see Theodore listed as living in his father's household, his occupation listed as a florist. In 1872, he met and married Elizabeth Morton. The couple enjoyed a European honeymoon paid for by their parents and returned to begin what they hoped would be a happy married life. In 1874, Otis announced he was moving to California to make his fortune. This was not especially strange, as Americans in the 19th century were incredibly mobile like this. They would frequently leave their communities to seek their fortune. But Theodore's time in California was a alleged disaster. He allegedly lost thousands of dollars in bad investments, and he returned to Massachusetts several years later, probably in 1878, sort of with his tail between his legs. It was upon his return from California that his family and friends began to notice that something was wrong with Theodore. He struggled to keep and find work, listless and unaware of his predicament. But perhaps more disturbingly, he had emotions that ranged out of his control. His mother-in-law remembered, quote, "He was very emotional." Oh boy. Oh geez, sorry, again. Okay. His mother-in-law remembered he was very emotional, would break down while reading. He complained of pain in his head and was listless at times. His brother-in-law recalled an incident when Otis visited him in New York City, saying, quote, "He was emotional, easily breaking into tears. The first night of his arrival, while at dinner and while in the presence of quite a large company of strangers, he broke into tears for some minutes at the mere mention of certain incidents of the late war." Around 1880, Theodore moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and partnered with James McKee in a storage business. The 1880 census lists him living with the McKee family, but for reasons that are unclear, their storage business venture failed. James McKee blamed Theodore and his erratic behavior and emotions for their failure, while the Otis family accused James McKee of being a shady character, perhaps defrauding Theodore Otis. In 1885, Theodore applied and was accepted to the National Home for Disabled and Volunteer Soldiers, colloquially known as the Soldiers' Home, which was a care facility for disabled or indigent Civil War veterans. This is the record of him being admitted to the Soldiers' Home. And you can see his admittance form there in 1885. His mental health had deteriorated so severely by that point that the soldiers' home did not keep him for long. And several years later, in 1887, they transferred him to what was known as the Government Hospital for the Insane, or colloquially known as St. Elizabeth's Hospital. You can see here he was admitted in 1887. The Government Hospital for the Insane, or St. Elizabeth's Hospital, was an insane asylum in Washington, D.C. that in 1866, Congress charged with caring for mentally ill soldiers and Civil War veterans who could prove that symptoms of their mental illness manifested within 3 years of their discharge. Theodore Otis was one of those. On his admittance form, it seems that asylum officials thought that perhaps his mental illness was caused by syphilis. And Theodore Otis's parents, perhaps because of that, may have launched a campaign to try and alter the diagnosis, which may explain why his hospital file is full of Civil War letters. His parents sent his war letters and underlined his entries, mentioning when he was sick or suffering from exposure. The hospital superintendent, Dr. William W. Godding, assessed Theodore Otis and decided he had not contracted syphilis. And instead, perhaps the wartime letters convinced Dr. Godding that Theodore's mental illness was caused by his time in the Civil War. Dr. Godding wrote, quote, "He suffered from diarrhea and probably from malaria and from exposure to cold while in the service, and that the exhaustion caused by these diseases was probably the origin of the slowly developing disease of the brain." This was standard diagnoses for 19th century mental health professionals who believed that disease and exposure could cause mental illness. Theodore Otis died 5 years after being admitted in the hospital in 1892. He died in St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Okay, let me tell you another story. This story centers around Prince Rivers. This is the only picture of Prince Rivers that we believe is around. We're not entirely certain that this is Prince Rivers pictured here, but according to experts on Prince Rivers, we think this is the one photo of him that exists. Prince Rivers was born enslaved near Beaufort, South Carolina, in the South Carolina Sea Islands. He was born on the plantation of Henry Middleton Stewart. And by the time the Civil War erupted, Prince Rivers was well known in the Beaufort area. He was Henry Middleton Stewart's carriage driver, and he was well known for his towering height as he stood at over 6 feet tall. Early in the war, the Union Army assaulted the South Carolina Sea Islands. This is a Civil War era map of the South Carolina Sea Islands, and you can see Beaufort at the top near Port Royal. And early in the war, the Union Army and Navy assaulted the South Carolina Sea Islands and defeated Confederates at the Battle of Port Royal. Enslavers like Henry Middleton Stewart panicked and began to pack up to move inland, and Prince Rivers took advantage of the chaos and escaped his bondage in the saddle of one of Middleton's horses, liberating his family in the process as well. Prince came into the orbit of General David Hunter, pictured here. Hunter was a committed abolitionist before the war, and with Prince Rivers in tow, David Hunter began to organize a clandestine regiment of former slaves that was colloquially known initially as Hunter's Regiment. Prince joined the regiment and eventually became a sergeant. That regiment, in 1863, when African-American men were officially enlisted in the war effort. Prior to 1863, African-American men could not officially enlist as soldiers. But in 1863, African-American men could officially enlist as soldiers, and Hunter's Regiment became the 1st South Carolina Infantry. It was later reorganized as the 33rd United States Colored Troops, though the men continued to refer to themselves as the 1st South Carolina. In the spring of 1863, Prince and the 1st South Carolina participated in a daring raid of Confederate-held Georgia and Florida. The unit freed slaves in the region, defeated Confederate cavalry at the Battle of Hundred Pines, and briefly claimed Jacksonville, Florida for the Union before being ordered to return to the Beaufort area. The daring raid of Prince Rivers and the 1st South Carolina was one of the first moments of the war where uniformed African Americans fought uniformed Confederates. And Americans who read about it were electrified by the reports of the heroism and the bravery of African American soldiers in the unit. Among those was President Abraham Lincoln, who wrote to General Hunter on the 1st of April saying, quote, "I'm glad to see the accounts of your colored force at Jacksonville, Florida. I see the enemy are driving at them fiercely, as is to be expected. It is important to the enemy that such a force shall not take shape and grow and thrive in the South. And in precisely the same proportion, it is important to us that it shall." The raid of the 1st South Carolina, however, was overshadowed by later conflicts involving African Americans. On May 27th, 1863, African American soldiers in the 1st and 3rd Louisiana Native Guards fought at the Battle of Port Hudson. The African American soldiers there made daring and heroic assaults against well-defended Confederate positions, giving up only after the 5th or 6th charge and only after half of their unit had already been killed or wounded. On June 7th, 1863, African American soldiers resisted a Confederate assault at Milliken's Bend. The African American troops there were outnumbered, poorly equipped, and barely trained, and still obstinately and bravely resisted the rebel charge, ultimately successfully defeating the Confederates. The most famous, however, was the assault at Fort Wagner, led by the all-Black 54th Massachusetts Infantry. The charge was a failure, but African American soldiers demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice themselves upon the altar of freedom at the Battle of Fort Wagner and at others. Following these well-publicized battles involving African American soldiers, many white Americans began to change their minds in some way or some fashion. Not all white Americans, but many had their minds changed on the role of Black soldiers in the Civil War. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton summarized these changes, writing to Abraham Lincoln, quote, "Many persons believed or pretended to believe and confidently asserted that freed slaves would not make good soldiers, that they would lack courage and could not be subjected to military discipline. Facts have shown how groundless were these apprehensions. The slave has proved his manhood and his capacity as an infantry soldier at Milliken's Bend, at the assault upon Port Hudson, and the storming of Fort Wagner." Following the war, and after a bitter political fight, the United States Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to former slaves. And that was followed several years later by the 15th Amendment, which granted the right to vote to all African American men. Prince Rivers returned from the war and relocated to Hamburg, South Carolina, a small South Carolina town across the Savannah River from Augusta, Georgia, that had a majority Black population after the war. The 1870 census shows Prince Rivers living in Hamburg, Massachusetts. It shows him owning his own home in Hamburg and owning some personal property. And his occupation was trial justice for the city. Essentially, he was a city employee in the post-war years. Years later, Prince's son Joshua would tell a WPA interviewer in the 1930s that his father Prince was pretty rich after the war was over. Sadly, tragically, the rights of African Americans, such as Prince Rivers, were chipped away by white Southerners, many of them former Confederates. And by 1876, African American rights in the South in places like Hamburg were on the edge of ruin. On July 4th, 1876, an argument ensued in Hamburg between two white men, Thomas Butler and Henry Getson, and Doc Adams, the African-American captain of the Black militia of Hamburg, which was parading on Market Street on July 4th for the centennial of the United States. Shortly thereafter, white Southerners descended and streamed into Hamburg to disarm Doc Adams and Hamburg's Black militia. A gunfight ensued, and members of the Black militia were trapped in the local armory. When a handful tried to make an escape, white Southerners who captured those trying to escape executed them. Half a dozen died in cold blood in what was known as the Hamburg Massacre. That, along with other racial violence throughout the American South, as well as the disastrous election of 1876, turned out to be the coup d'etat for Reconstruction and African American rights in the South. Prince Rivers lost his house and much of his property, all of it allegedly seized from him by white Southerners. He was reduced to working as a carriage driver, the same work he had done as a slave. The 1880 census here lists him no longer living in Hamburg and no longer owning property, and his occupation was a farmhand. So the question is, why did someone like Theodore Otis become mentally ill and someone like Prince Rivers did not? Why did someone like Theodore Otis end up at St. Elizabeth's Hospital and someone like Prince Rivers did not? We see this dynamic reflected at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Between 1860 and 1890, for instance, at St. Elizabeth's, roughly 2,700 white Civil War veterans became patients at St. Elizabeth's Hospital during that time. And during the same time, roughly, give or take a few, around 50 African-American Civil War veterans became patients at St. Elizabeth's Asylum during this time. And the key question is, why? Why was there this disparity at somewhere like St. Elizabeth's? This is a complicated question, and there's not one single answer. And so I'll start with the most obvious answer. And the most obvious answer is access. While a place like St. Elizabeth's was open to African-American patients, it was open to on a limited basis. There were never the same amount of beds for African-American patients at St. Elizabeth's as there was for white patients. So even at a place like St. Elizabeth's, access is not equitable. When we zoom out and look nationally, that story gets even starker. If we look at the United States in 1860, there was roughly 27 insane asylums throughout the United States. Of those 27, the number that offered equitable access to African-American patients, especially in the South, and equitable access meaning that they had sort of the same number of beds or the same number of treatment opportunities, that number for Southern African-Americans was 0. There wasn't a single insane asylum in 1860 that offered a level of equitable access for African-Americans. Many insane asylums during this time didn't offer access to African-American patients at all. They weren't allowed at all. Other insane asylums at the time offered a limited access to African Americans. And oftentimes, African American patients who entered the asylum were just a trickle. Let's fast forward to 1885, when the number of American insane asylums had almost roughly doubled to 55. What did the number look like for access for Southern African American patients? That had grown to just one. There was one single insane asylum that was a dedicated treatment facility for African American patients. The insane asylums throughout the United States in 1885 remained the same largely. They either didn't offer access to African American patients or they did so on a limited basis. Simply put, African Americans did not have equal access to medical care in the 19th century and to asylums in the same rate that white Americans did. What this means is that it is possible that thousands of African Americans who might have struggled with mental illness in the 19th century are invisible to us. Their record is silent, in part because of the lack of access afforded them in the 19th century. So the obvious and immediate answer to that question of why is access. That African Americans simply just did not have the equitable access that white Americans did. That single asylum that offered access to African American patients in the South by 1885 is also worth looking a little deeper into. That single asylum got its start in 1869 as Howard's Grove Hospital. Originally a Confederate hospital, Howard's Grove came into the possession of the Union, who turned it during the war into a hospital for African American soldiers. In 1869, it became a makeshift asylum for Southern African Americans in Virginia. It was barely a workable asylum, with the first superintendent, D.B. Conrad, describing it as, quote, crude as can be, end quote, and made up of just, quote, a few wooden shanties. So even the one treatment facility dedicated to African American patients was not of the same quality as white institutions, white insane asylums that mostly treated white Americans. Howard's Grove eventually in 1885 became Central State Hospital in Petersburg, Virginia. It was the first and for a time, the only asylum that exclusively treated African American patients. So part of this question, again, is obviously about access and the lack of equitable access. Another part of this question might have to do with racism and medicine and how interwoven racism and white supremacy was with American medicine in the 19th century. Of the nearly 200,000 Black soldiers in the war, 146,000 were from the South. Most of those were undoubtedly former slaves. And former slaves encountered doctors as what historian Marie Jenkins Schwartz calls, quote, the agents of slaveholders. And the experience of African Americans, especially former slaves in the antebellum years, who came into the orbit of doctors and medical practitioners, was one of racism. Racist ideas were common among antebellum doctors, North and South, in the antebellum United States. In the antebellum South, doctors and medical practitioners did not serve the health of the enslaved, but instead primarily served the slaveholders by trying to engender a more healthy and fertile slave labor force. Additionally, Southern doctors used psychiatry to uphold white supremacy and racism of the slaveholding South. For instance, Dr. Samuel Cartwright, pictured here, used psychiatry to try and explain away why African Americans became fugitive slaves and escaped from slavery. he coined a fictive ailment he called drapetomania. And Cartwright explained that fugitive slaves suffered, quote, a disease of the mind as any other species of mental alienation. This was, of course, ludicrous, that African Americans escaping from slavery suffered from some mental illness, but instead, it was a fictitious ailment that Cartwright used so white Southern slaveholders could perhaps feel better about themselves and the institution of slavery. Meanwhile, Dr. John Galt, at the superintendent of Eastern Lunatic Asylum in Virginia, argued paradoxically that slavery insulated African Americans from mental illness. He said, quote, "They are removed from much of the mental excitement to which the free population of the Union is necessarily exposed in the daily routine of life." And he lists those mental excitements as religion or the intensity of political discussion. This again is ludicrous and boggles the mind, but racism and racist ideas were woven in to medicine and the ideas of antebellum doctors. It wasn't just psychiatry that was afflicted by racism and racist ideas in the 19th century South. Institutional medicine routinely abused African Americans. For instance, in the book Bones in the Basement by Robert Blakely and Judith Harrington, they relate the story of when in 1989, workers renovating the Medical College of Georgia building in Augusta discovered human remains in the basement. Ultimately, more than 9,000 human bone remains were found in the earthen basement of the original Medical College of Georgia building. Research indicated most of those bones were from African-American cadavers that had been dissected by medical students. Cadaver dissection in most of the antebellum South was illegal. And so the college had engaged in illicit grave robbing to get cadavers for medical students to dissect. And they had procured most of those corpses by grave robbing from the local African-American cemetery. This was a practice that was not unique to Augusta, Georgia. For instance, 2/3 of all corpses dissected by medical students at Johns Hopkins University were the corpses of African Americans, again, stolen from local Black cemeteries near the college. The result of the Civil War did little to alter racist ideas among mental health professionals and doctors in the United States. For instance, a common diagnosis for African American patients who could get access to an insane asylum for treatment in the post-war United States was often this: freedom or the result of the war, meaning that many psychiatrists, North and South, believed that emancipation had driven African Americans insane. Dr. J.M. Buchanan, a doctor at a Mississippi insane asylum, commented, quote, "While he," meaning African Americans, "had a master, he had no thought of the morrow. Not a single care burdened his mind. There was nothing to disturb his equilibrium, and he was always the same fat, sleek, and contented individual." This, of course, was ludicrous, again, and it is perhaps no wonder that African Americans who had access to asylums might have hesitated to voluntarily submit to treatment at an asylum or a hospital. Such racist claims of doctors and asylum superintendents may have discouraged African Americans from seeking treatment, or those African Americans who had access to asylums from seeking treatment. To do so would be to submit themselves to the humiliating judgment of 19th century doctors, like those such as J.M. Buchanan, who believed, ludicrously, that freedom had driven them insane. There might be another reason as well for why so few African-American Civil War veterans became mentally ill in the post-war period. And that answer might lie in the nature of the war experience for Black soldiers. In 1863, Prince Rivers gave a speech that voiced this experience, saying, quote, "Now we soldiers are men the first time in our lives. Now we can look our old soldiers our old masters in the face. They used to sell us and whip us, and we did not dare say one word. Now we aren't afraid if they meet us to run the bayonet through them." African-American men in the Civil War, like Prince Rivers, were literally soldiers of freedom, contributing to the destruction of slavery and helping to free millions of their brethren, sometimes their own friends and family, from bondage. Because of this, the war and what it achieved was far less ambiguous for African-American veterans than it was for their white compatriots. And while obviously the results of the war were not perfect, such as the tragic decline of Reconstruction, African-American veterans could still be comforted by the knowledge that they had done everything absolutely possible to destroy slavery and fight for equality. Near the end of the war, and I want to leave us with this, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a white officer in the 1st South Carolina, Prince Rivers's unit, listened to a sermon given by an African-American soldier named Thomas Long. Long's sermon particularly affected Higginson, and so he scribbled it down. Long said, quote, "We can remember when we first enlisted, it was hardly safe for us to pass by the camps to Beaufort and back, unless we went in a mob and carried our sidearms. But we whipped down all that. We lived it down by our natural manhood. And now the white soldiers take us by the hand and say, 'Brother soldier.' That's what this regiment did for the Ethiopian race. If we hadn't become soldiers, all might have gone back as it was before. Our freedom might have slipped through the 2 houses of Congress, and President Lincoln's 4 years might have passed by and nothing been done for us. But now things can never go back because we have showed our energy and our courage and our natural manhood." It's possible, though we don't know for sure, of course, that this may have comforted the minds of African-American veterans and resulted in perhaps a more healthy psychological equilibrium in the post-war years. But we can't, of course, ignore the role of institutionalized racism in 19th century medicine played in this story. And as a nation, recently, more Americans have become aware of the role that racism has played historically in medical treatment in America. From lack of access to lower quality treatment, to poorer health outcomes at almost every measurable level. My story demonstrates that racism in medicine and psychiatry has a longer history, perhaps longer than we care to admit, and it can help inform us about our world today and how we see the world today. All right, thank you. I hope you enjoyed this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carroll. Very interesting presentation, very thought-provoking. Are there any questions? We have a comment, very moving. If you have a question, put it either in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and I will repeat them for Dylan. Questions or comments, anyone? Okay, we'll just give another minute while I make a comment or two. Another comment, I appreciated this lecture very much. If you do have any thoughts for future lectures, please let me know. You can reach me through the Med Society, or I will put my email into the chat box right now. So if you have any ideas for future talks and or future presenters, please go ahead and let me know. Got a question or two that's come in that was very good, very informative. Did Dorothy Dix have any, and it got cut off at INFLI? I'm not sure what the question means. If you can reinsert the question in the Q&A, we will try to answer it for you. Oh, influence. Did Dorothy Dix have any influence?
Generally, Dorothy Dix had influence on Civil War nurses. She was in charge of Civil War nurses and organizing Northern Civil War nurses during the war. And so her influence was over that. And then obviously before that, Dorothea Dix was tied up in the asylum movement. The asylum movement was, part of what we call the Second Great Awakening. It was a evangelical revival in the early 19th century, where adherents kind of wanted to make the earth perfect for what they anticipated was Jesus Christ's second coming at the millennium. And so they looked around at, the United States and sort of said, wow, there's a lot that's messed up here. We need to fix this before old JC comes back, or he's going to be pissed at what we've done to this world he left us. So there became this reform movement to reform all the ills of society. One of those was mental illness, which prior to the asylum movement was really horrific. Mental illness and mental health treatment was nightmarish before the asylum movement. Most communities and families tried to take care of the mentally ill. If they couldn't, they ended up in prisons or in poorhouses, which were essentially 19th century homeless shelters is the equivalent. And the asylum movement comes in, which seeks to create a more humane treatment of mental illness. Dorothea Dix is sort of the guiding light, American guiding light of the asylum movement. The asylum movement had originated in Europe, respectively in England by William Tuke and in France by Philippe Pinel. And Dorothea Dix went over to Europe and glimpsed the asylum movement, and she came back to the United States and zealously wanted to institute the asylum movement in the United States. She started with her home state of Massachusetts, basically bludgeoned Massachusetts to create a state insane asylum. And then she went from state to state, just repeating this process, cataloging the treatment of the mentally ill in the state, compiling a report, and then trying to bludgeon state legislators into creating state asylums. And she almost single-handedly does this on her own. So yeah, I mean, she has a very important part to play in the story.
Okay, we have a couple more questions here. One, in actual battle, was there any greater background impact between white and freedom slave soldiers?
What's meant by background impact? I don't quite understand that.
If you can clarify that in the Q&A box, we'll come back to that question. What were the most frequent symptoms of mental illness?
They're not terribly different from today. They classified symptoms mostly in what they called mania, which we might call anxiety. Mania was a broad umbrella for anxiety or confusion or paranoia or sometimes violent reactions. And they classified symptoms under a broad umbrella called melancholy or melancholia, which was a kind of broad umbrella for depression and depressive thoughts. So, symptoms ranged between, things that aren't terribly different from today. People who were anxious or paranoid or depressed or suicidal, or had obsessive thoughts. These were many of the symptoms of the time. What they believed caused mental illness was way different than how we view it. Asylum superintendents, like they were called oftentimes alienists at the time because they treated those who were alienated from society. And they thought that mental illness could be caused by physical causes, like a really bad case of disease or a blow to the head or exposure to the elements. Or they thought what they called moral cases could cause mental illness. This included masturbation, which they thought could cause mental illness. It included, coveting, sort of your neighbors being jealous or being covetous, sort of what they believe to be immoral activities, or excessive drinking and smoking they believed could cause mental illness as well. So they imagined and conceived mental illness in much different ways than we do today. But the symptoms were surprisingly similar.
Okay, thank you. Another question, were the VA or old soldiers' homes of any help?
Yeah, the Robert E. Lee home for Confederate soldiers and veterans in Virginia were very helpful. And the records of the NHVDS, the soldiers' home in Hampton, Virginia, were also very helpful. Historians like James Martin has written about soldiers' homes and veterans who ended up in them. And they're very helpful to kind of, help piece together where some of these veterans ended up. Many of the soldiers' home records, especially from the North, are digitized now. So you can find them on Ancestry or other digital search engines. And you can also glimpse mental illness in these records. And it became such an issue for the soldiers' homes, mental illness became such an issue for the soldiers' homes that in 1884, Congress passed a law which allowed the soldiers' homes to more easily and quickly transfer mentally ill veterans in the soldiers' homes to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And so after 1884, you see just a flood of veterans from soldiers' homes being transferred to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, suggesting that this was becoming a major issue for the soldiers' homes who weren't equipped to take care of mentally ill patients. But yeah, in short, the soldiers' homes records are incredibly helpful and interesting and fascinating.
Additional question, can you recommend a book about the 19th century psychiatry and the role of asylums?
Oof, that's a good question. Gerald Grobe has written a number of books about 19th century psychiatry and the role of asylums. I would recommend anything by Gerald Grobe, G-R-O-B. And his work's been very helpful for me.
And we'll go back to a prior question. I have a clarification on it. The question was, an actual battle, was there any greater background impact between whites and freedom slave soldiers? And what he meant by background was a feeling that a soldier would have after a physical or mental breakdown after a serious physical battle.
That's a good question. And it's a question I can't entirely answer because we just don't have the records to conclusively answer a question like that. There are, unfortunately, there wasn't an army official going around interviewing soldiers after a battle to see how they felt. My speculation, just from what I've looked at and researched, is that there was a difference, and that in my research and experience, and this is again just speculation. I don't know this for sure, but from what I've looked at, white soldiers seem to suffer in greater numbers from physical or mental breakdowns after a serious battle. That's in part because white soldiers just fought more battles than African American soldiers. That wasn't for any reason except that white Union Army officials were hesitant to send African American soldiers into battles, mostly because of racist ideas that were pervasive among the Army elite, who were unsure about African Americans' performance in battles. And so African Americans just didn't see as many battles as white soldiers, which explains why white soldiers seem to have larger numbers of negative reactions. But I also, in the records I've looked at of African American soldiers after battles, there does, seem to be a difference. And I think we can trace that back to, again, the experience for Black soldiers, that they are literally soldiers of freedom. And white soldiers who viewed African American soldiers during battles often commented how hard they fought. There's a great letter from Guy Taylor, who was a white Wisconsin soldier. And at the siege of Petersburg, he writes his wife and says, there's African American soldiers fighting with him at Petersburg. And he says, I'm paraphrasing, but he essentially says the African American soldiers are ferocious fighters. They don't stop. Us white soldiers, Union and Confederate, we preferred, and I'm paraphrasing again, but he said, we prefer not to fight unless we have to. But, African Americans, they'll fight all the time. They're ferocious fighters. And, I think what Taylor missed, but we can understand, is that African American soldiers were, fighting their former enslavers. This was for some of them a dream that they had only dreamed about. And now they're able to, as Prince Rivers said, meet their former enslavers on a battlefield and run a bayonet through them. African American soldiers are also literally fighting for their freedom because, Confederate soldiers had declared in 1863 that they would not take any Black soldiers prisoner. They would either execute them or re-enslave them. And so, in a way that white soldiers don't understand, Black soldiers are literally fighting for their lives in the American Civil War.
And we have two additional questions. Can you elaborate on possible implications to medical practice today?
Yeah, I think, and I kind of already said this, but I think this story sadly only informs what we are increasingly aware of, which is that we have a shameful sort of lack of access for African Americans, and health outcomes for African Americans on almost every measurable level are lower for whites because of that lack of access and that lack of quality care. And I think this story tells us that this didn't come out of nowhere. This has a long history in the United States, unfortunately. We're kind of, still living in this shadow. And, where we are today with some of our racial disparities in health outcomes and in medicine are not an aberration. They're sort of in keeping with this history.
And one looks like a last question. beyond the later asylum system, what were typical treatments for mental illness that manifested during the war? Was there an increase in psychiatric pharmaceutical development, or would it come much later?
That's a great question. For the American experience, it comes later. And the developments are mostly in the 20th century. There isn't any major developments as far as, treatment protocols for mental illness in the 19th century. There's a sort of insider baseball debate in American medicine in the 19th century between traditional alienists, those who ran the asylums, and a new sort of medical practice known as neurology. And neurologists thought that mental illness was caused by nerve damage or nerve irritation. And neurologists like Silas Weir Mitchell and others argued that there were, social causes of mental illness, such as, the changing business landscape, the spread of railroads and telegraphs, and how life and business was changing. Mitchell argued was affecting the mental health of Americans. Somewhat, it was a somewhat novel argument in the 19th century. But that was mostly sort of an insider baseball debate between medical practitioners that most Americans didn't quite pay attention to. And it's not really until the 20th century that the major advancements in treatments for mental illness come. Those advancements, don't sound very novel, but basically what doctors learned was, soldiers exposed to repeated combat for a prolonged period of time eventually broke down. And especially during World War II, the American military learned that it was a matter of time, really, if you exposed a man to sort of repeated successive combat operations before he broke down. And so the Army tried to build in sort of breaks for men. They would be taken off the front line, taken to a non-combat area, able to relax for a while. And they sort of hoped that that could short circuit any sort of mental illness. And it's not, really until the introduction of things like penicillin, which, end the scourge of syphilis, which late stage syphilis had resulted in an array of, neurocognitive dementia, and syphilis sort of penicillin cures the syphilis scourge. And, new tranquilizer medicines, cure a lot of the chronic conditions that were piling up in insane asylums. And by the 1950s and 60s, most Americans who had previously been in insane asylums, could be out on these sort of tranquilizer medicines in much more controllable fashion.
I think that's the end of the questions. I thank you very much, Dylan. I also like to thank Sam Mello for helping to organize the evening, and hope you check out our website. Keep your eye on the website for future lectures. And thanks again for coming. Sam, do you have any closing comments?
I don't. Thank you, everyone.